Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining this second webinar, where we are very pleased to have Radhika Desai with us, a political economist and political scientist at the University of Manitoba, right? And Radhika, I will let you do the introduction about yourself, and then please also, of course, about your analysis of world affairs.
Sure. So yeah, I'm basically a professor of political studies at the University of Manitoba, but I've always done politics in combination with political economy. And then in 2013, I published a book called Geopolitical Economy After U.S. Hegemony, Globalization, and Empire, in which I proposed a very different way of looking at world affairs, because none of the dominant approaches in international relations or in international political economy can really help us make sense of the world in which we live today. And so what I'll do is I'll just try to give you a flavor of my understanding. I've prepared a talk. So basically, and also the overall, and I feel that this perspective, which I would like to familiarize you over the next 30, 40 minutes, is really a better way of understanding why we are experiencing the kind of turbulence that we are experiencing in the world today, or rather, why we are experiencing the turbulence and why we are experiencing this kind of turbulence. Why is the U.S. so militarily aggressive? And also, it kind of also lines up with a article I wrote during the pandemic. Actually, I wrote a series of articles trying to understand what was going on. And one of them, which was kind of the end of the series, was entitled "The Fate of Capitalism Hangs in the Balance of International Power." So it's a broadly Marxist approach, but at the same time, I'm also very critical. Marxists are, of course, critical of bourgeois theories, mainstream theories, but it is also critical of much of what passes for Marxism today. So that's a sort of preliminary. So obviously, in trying to understand what's going on today, one of the problems is very often people think in terms of single causes, and many of them are extremely powerful, no doubt, but it is not the correct way of thinking about it. So while, of course, the military-industrial complex is extremely powerful, it's not the sole explanation. Or the Israel lobby, again, very powerful, but not same explanation. So really, we're talking about approaches. But when we get to approaches to the study of world affairs, international relations, whatever you want to call it, um, none of the major approaches that prevail in international relations and international political economy actually work. So let's take them very quickly, one by one. Realism, of course, to me, it has always, this idea that all countries will be equally aggressive militarily and they are all seeking to expand power, has always been a cover for understanding U.S. aggression, U.S. Expansionism, etc., etc. Nor can it really explain why so many of the problems today emanate exclusively from the United States. Nor can it explain why, if you actually look at it, the behavior of countries like the Soviet Union or China, which are not capitalist, has in fact been largely defensive. It has not been aggressive in the same way as the US has been. So realism does not work. And it's also a bit of my favorite joke these days is that realism, because it has this notion of national self-interest, which is completely, it does not correspond to anything that motivates foreign policy. So, the states pursue their national interest. But since this does not work, because the national interest is kind of the interest of, say, in the case of the United States, all Americans, whereas, of course, US foreign policy is not animated by the interests of all Americans. It is animated by the interests of a corporate elite. So, it does not work. So then you have to sort of trot out a secondary hypothesis like the IPAC, which is what John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt did, that there is an Israel lobby, and that's why realism cannot explain what's really going on. So, there are many problems with realism. Next, when you get to liberalism or the globalization thesis, that's simply empirically wrong. I mean, the states have remained important in understanding, what's going on in international relations. So-called globalization has not lifted all boats. Quite frankly, had it done so, we would not be here. We would not have so much to worry about. And of course, historically, I mean, free markets and free trade have never promoted prosperity. Indeed, as I'm about to explain to you, the only way to understand the dynamics of world affairs is to understand this fact that free markets and free trade do not produce development and growth and progress and so on. And that instead, it a defensive reaction on the part of states in the form of state directed developmental state type development has been the process through which productive capacity has spread around the world, whether you talk about the industrialization of the United States or Germany or Japan, or later of the Soviet Union or China or any other country. Obviously, there is a huge literature on this by the developmental state theorists that you will be aware of, whether it's Alice Amsden or Robert Wade or Hajun Chang or what have you. That makes sense. And even Keynes, I mean, I don't have very many quotes here, but even Keynes pointed out back in 1934 in his National Self-Sufficiency, he says, we are pacifists today with so much strength of conviction that if the economic internationalist could win this point, he would recapture our support. But it does not now seem obvious that a great concentration of national effort on the capture of foreign trade, that the penetration of the country's economic structure by the resources and influence of foreign capitalists, and a close dependence of our own economic life on the fluctuating economic policies of foreign countries are safeguards and assurances for international peace. That is to say, free trade, free markets are not going to lead to international peace. Indeed, he says it is easier in the light of experience. Naturally, he's writing after the outbreak of the First World War. He says it's easy in the light of experience and foresight to argue quite the contrary. So the globalization thesis is simply it's just an assertion of the basic laissez-faire view, and which, as I wish argue, is actually not. It's actually an assertion. It's an ideology of imperialism for reasons I will explain in a second. And then there is this thesis of US hegemony. The US hegemony thesis is also implausible. It cannot explain multipolarity. It cannot explain the relatively peaceful rise of countries like China or other countries, in its own time, Russia, amid the chaos created by US and Western decline. So also the hegemony stability thesis also requires us, or the way in which people argue that the US remains hegemonic despite great evidence to the contrary is to say, well, I'm looking for across the horizon, where is the new hegemon? There is no hegemon, so the US will remain hegemonic. This is not such a good argument. Indeed, and I'll explain what mine has been. But this search for new hegemons is completely fruitless. And also, as I've shown in my own writing, the purpose of hegemony stability theory was to somehow theorize the US role in the world. And despite the great erudition of writers on hegemony stability, particularly the erudition of the world systems writers like Immanuel Wallerstein, Giovanni Arrighi, etc., their theoretical framework cannot explain the main case that they are supposed to explain, that is the United States. Whatever they say is true of the Italian city-states or the Holland or Britain, does not apply in the case of the US. To take just one example, the idea has been that capital flows in the declining phase from the declining power to the rising power, whereas the United States, of course, is absorbing capital from around the world at a great rate of knots. So in its period of decline, which they say it is in. So So while I agree that the current US aggression is animated by a decline of US power, I do not agree that the US was hegemonic. The assumption that the US is hegemonic prevents us from understanding the recent past, and I would say the effective past of our own time. That is the past that is still relevant to understanding where we are at today. Now, having said all this, I don't wish to imply that scholars who are working in these approaches will never get anything right, that they will never be able to rise above the limitations of the approaches that they are working within. Individual erudition and intelligence will always, exceed the limitations of these approaches. But what I am saying is that they're working with the wrong tools. So I would say this is the important thing to remember. So my own view, which is based, the one that I'm about to elaborate, geopolitical economy, is also based on a larger critique of 20th and 21st century organization of knowledge. And what I take to be central to this is the emergence of neoclassical economics beginning in the late 19th century, and then the creation of a kind of social scientific division of labor around it, beginning with Max Weber, who was originally trained in economics, and he created this separation of economy and society. And then around it, we have the rise of other social scientific disciplines, political science, and what have you. And the interesting thing is that each one of these disciplines takes the narrative of neoclassical economics, which is that capitalism can be, should be a self-regulating system, which does not need state interference, etc., etc. This narrative is largely taken to be true by the other social scientists. So against this, my approach is historical, it is materialist, it is broadly Marxist, but I underline broadly, because it is also critical of the bulk of what passes for Marxist economics today and the bulk of what is Western Marxism. And this is primarily because, as I've shown in a number of writings that I've done, from a very early point in time, Marxists also ended up, rather than, when neoclassical economics emerged, and in many ways it was directed against forces like Marxism, socialism, etc., instead of taking up cudgels frontally with it, apart from criticizing neoclassical economics for ignoring the exploitation of labor, for the rest, the Marxist economists were always trying to fit Marxism into neoclassical economics. But if you consider the fact that these are completely antithetical disciplines. For example, value has no place in neoclassical economics. Marxists do not think that there is a separate sphere of the economy. They understand it as political economy, class relations, etc., etc. Neoclassical economics is fundamentally ahistorical. Marxism is nothing if not historical. So for all of these reasons, it was never going to work. But of course, because it doesn't work, it's a never-ending endeavor. You keep trying to, one way or the other, you keep trying to fit the two together. So I also part company with the bulk of what passes for Marxism, particularly in the West. So my own argument has been, and I should say that I began writing geopolitical economy in order to criticize the globalization thesis. And originally, I was going to criticize the globalization thesis from the point of view of a theory of U.S. hegemony, in the sense that I took that to be true, because I was, as a scholar, I had been very impressed with, as I said, the erudition of particularly world system theorists and so on. So I took some version of hegemony stability theory to be true. But once I began to try to operationalize it in order to use it for a critique of globalization, I realized that it does not hold water. There are as many definitions of hegemony as there are writers, possibly more. And that in the end, so having realized this, I ended up taking, and of course, I also considered hegemony stability, particularly in its world systems version, to be a form of Marxism. But all of these on all of these points, I was disillusioned, and I ended up having to fashion a different approach. So in the end, my work became a critique of what I call cosmopolitan ideologies that say that the world economy is a unified whole, a seamlessly unified whole in which nation states don't matter, free markets and free trade rule. And either it is unified by markets alone, which is the kind of free trade globalization thesis, or it is unified by a leading country, a hegemonic country, but that once you have this hegemony, then it is also a seamlessly unified world economy, and this is exactly what seemed to me to be the problem. So the idea was to understand that this is these cosmopolitan ideologies are not only not true, but in fact the reason they persist is because they are ideologies of imperialism. The whole purpose of imperialism is, through using these ideologies and of course many other instruments, force, policy prescriptions, institutions, etc., is to open up the rest of the world economy to the activities and penetration of metropolitan corporate capital. That is the whole point. That's why you need ideologies of openness, of cosmopolitan ideology, what Friedrich List would have called cosmopolitan ideologies. Okay, so my argument has been, that it's not that the US is hegemonic, not that the US is once hegemonic and is now declining, but that the US was never hegemonic. So though in the early 20th century it began to nurse an ambition, witness to the power of a decline in the power of the UK, it began to nurse the ambition, in the words of one historian, to replace the Britain as the managing segment of the world economy. It never succeeded. Indeed, back then, it also whittled down the ambition. By the early 20th century, warfare was already so costly, expensive, deadly. On top of that, of course, the world had already been divided up by the old imperialist powers. So they were quite explicit. They were not concerned to acquire an empire comparable to Britain's. That was not would not be possible, and this should not be tried. But they would settle for making the dollar the world's money, and so this still. And my argument is that even this whittled down ambition did not succeed, because the dollar essentially was already problematic before 1971. For the simple reason, I'll just take a brief digression here. For the simple, or rather, I'll take a minute to explain why. The sterling's role in the world was not based on its existence as a national currency of Britain. It was possible only because it was an imperial currency. It was possible only because Britain was able to extract surpluses from its non-settler colonies, like India, British India, of course, being the biggest of them, but also other places, Caribbean, Africa, and so on. So it drew surpluses from these countries and then was able to export these surpluses as its famous capital exports to Europe, to the United States, and to its other settler colonies. And so this is also the reason why the period of the sterling standard is a period of the fastest industrialization of these parts of the world. But of course, without an empire the US could not exactly export capital. So it, of course, provided liquidity through deficits. This was subject to the Triffin dilemma, which already became operational by the early 1960s. The US needed to create a gold pool in order to keep the dollar's gold backing. During the 60s, it tried every possible expedient to try to keep this backing. This failed. 71, the backing had to be taken away. And since then, it is my thesis that what looks like a continuous dollar hegemony has actually relied on a series of financializations, expansions of purely financial activity in order to expansion of purely financial activity in dollars in order to create a financial demand for dollars, which would counteract the Triffin dilemma. And I will come to why this system is now reaching its limits in a couple of minutes, in a few minutes. Okay, so this understanding of capitalism, this understanding of world affairs is based on an understanding of capitalism as being fundamentally contradictory. It's a which we can go into if you like, but I don't want to bore you with a lot of Marxist theory, but it is a contradictory system, and the state is necessary in this system is constantly required to address the contradictions, to manage the contradictions of capital, whether through domestic actions, whether it is concessions to the working class or repression of the working class or regulation of capital or what have you, expansion of demand, blah blah, etc., or through international actions. And those international actions, of course, take the form of imperialism. It is an account of international relations which is specific to the age of capital, and therefore it does not, talk about Thucydides or what have you. You have to understand that capitalism, the age of capital, has its own dynamics in international relations. It is not easily comparable to other social formations. It is capitalism being contradictory, therefore it is spatially imperial, and chronologically it has its own history. It does not stay the same because each contradiction requires some new intervention which then changes it, and so on. Yeah, so it changes it historically. And so the state is central to the management of this. So there is never a seamless world economy. There are always national economies which are connected, of course, with other economies, but it is the character of these connections we have to understand. We cannot just assume that there is globalization, etc. So and this and now I'm just going to shift to imperialism, because that's what and imperialism. So geopolitical economy places imperialism at the heart of understanding international relations, which, you can take our international relations anywhere in the world, but they will not talk about imperialism as being central, but that is what is central. Now, imperialism requires two sets of things from the subordinated periphery. Capitalist countries require two sets of things. Number one, they require, of course, the subordinated periphery to accept its excess commodities and to accept excess capital. And on the other side, it requires from the subordinated periphery cheap goods and cheap labor. But these two sets of needs are contradictory, because on the one hand, the periphery needs to be prosperous and stable enough to accept excess commodities and excess capital, and it needs to be poor enough to yield up its raw materials, its intermediate goods, its wage goods cheaply to the imperialist countries. So this contradiction has its own history, which again I can't go into in great detail, but essentially, so that's one set of contradictions. And then there is another one, which is that, of course, the rest of the world is not going to take imperial subordination lying down. They know that imperial subordination involves essentially the denial of development. So, for example, countries like the United States or Germany were very explicit in their phase of industrialization that they were going to undertake state-directed industrialization precisely because they did not wish to remain agricultural appendages of the UK. And so back then, this, and yeah, anyway. And this is also, of course, what it happens today when we look at successful instances of development elsewhere in the world. So this means that the dynamic of international relations, what Trotsky called uneven and combined development, is primarily about development of. So again, this is something that is not talked about. International relations talked about in terms of military power, diplomatic power, etc., etc., but it is primarily about developing your society, structurally transforming it in order to create industrialization, etc., etc. Imperialism demands that there should be complementarity in the high value producing between the high value producing economies of the imperial core and the rest of the world. The resistance to imperialism rejects this complementary role and says we want to achieve similarity in terms of economic power and so on. So this is really what it's about. And I should just as another point, I will simply add that capitalism also in this understanding, you also have to understand, I said before, that capitalism has its own history. It is not just established and then remain the same. And the way Marx envisages this history, which I find very plausible, is that capitalism, which requires competition as fundamental to its dynamic, this competition eventually leads to monopoly, because in the process of competition, the weaker enterprises are competed out, and of course the successful enterprises become larger and larger. So capitalism was indeed already arriving at its monopoly phase while Marx was still alive, and Marx wrote about this. And so he said that once capitalism arrives at its monopoly phase, it will have become ripe for socialism. This is an interesting point, which not even the monthly review people who write so much about monopoly, Brown, Sweezy, etc., they don't pick up on, which is really quite interesting. So, and in a certain sense, I would say that this has, broadly speaking, turned out to be true. So my idea is that the world, my argument is that the world economy had already become multipolar in the late 19th and early 20th century with the industrialization of the second bevy of powers in the face of British domination of the world market, Germany, United States, Japan, etc. And their industrialization had already made the world multipolar. Their industrialization could still be capitalist because there were still colonies to be had, essentially. Um, and of course, the inter-imperial competition between them gave rise to, issued eventually into the First World War. And this inaugurated, I love Arno Meyer's term, the 30 years crisis, because of course the two world wars were umbilically connected with one another. The First World War did not settle anything, so inevitably you had a Second World War. So this is a big 30 years crisis in the early 20th century, and this was a joint crisis of both capitalism and imperialism. And since then, both have been declining, not obviously in any kind of linear or even very obvious way, but nevertheless declining. Imperialism, because of course this was the peak, the 30 years crisis was the crisis of imperialism, in which imperialist powers, of course, went to war with one another, more or less destroyed one another quite significantly. It was also in this context that that socialism arrives on the historical scene, because after this point, there is no way of developing in a capitalist fashion. The only way you can develop is through some kind of planned industrialization of the sort attempted in the Soviet Union and China today. And that is why, accepting countries like South Korea or Taiwan, there has not been, which are, of course, front lines of against communism, etc., front lines of imperialism, you have not had significant industrialization, successful industrialization anywhere except under socialist auspices. Of course, it was a crisis of imperialism in another sense, in the sense that the anti-imperialist, anti-colonial forces became more powerful in this period, so that by the time this period ended, by 1945, it was very clear that decolonization was inevitable. And very interestingly, and this is something that I've been insisting on more and more, is that to resolve this crisis, if you consider, it's one of the historical ironies that in order to resolve this crisis, you needed the forces of communism. The crisis created by capitalism and its imperialism could not be resolved without the intervention of socialist forces, of the Soviet Union and of Chinese communist forces and communist forces of other countries in that region. So both a victory in Europe and victory against Japan were required these forces, which also paid the heaviest price in terms of lives, etc. So and then capitalism is also declining because, of course, you have the Great Depression in the middle of the 30 years crisis. You have people like Alvin Henson coming up with the secular stagnation thesis. Writers like Keynes, Polanyi, all thought that at the end of the Second World War, the world would take a decisive turn to the left. Hayek was afraid of the same thing, and he writes his Road to Serfdom to forestall this. But then people think that, the golden age of capitalism essentially, negates these fears, negates these expectations. You had this, capitalism has regained its mojo, etc. But I would refute that. The golden age growth is takes into account the growth of the whole world. And in this period, the socialist countries grew at a very fast clip. The Soviet Union, China grew at a very fast clip. The developing countries were also growing because they were all undertaking some or the other kind of left-leaning a project of national autonomous development. And in the first world countries, as Eric Hobsbawm pointed out, the boom was, or rather, in the first world countries, welfare states had been created. States committed themselves to Keynesian macroeconomic management and so on, all of which created the conditions for the boom. And these reforms, the welfare state and so on, were reforms that, as Hobsbawm pointed out, would have been rejected as socialist even in the past, but they had to be undertaken because capitalism was weakened, working classes were strengthened, anti-imperialist forces were strengthened in this period, and this required that to happen. Of course, the underlying system in the first world countries still remained capitalist, and as is its wont, it ran into crisis 2 or 3 decades later. You had this big crisis of stagnation, crisis of profitability, crisis of imperialism, as shown by the rise of inflation, and many other elements to it. A declining profitability, demand saturation, in my view, was of course a very big part of it. And I don't want to go into it in great detail, and I'm nearly at an end. So essentially, what I want to argue is that in this context, what we are uh, uh, okay, so neoliberalism is adopted as the way out of the crisis, but neoliberalism itself is ultimately, in my view, one of the biggest frauds. I mean, neoclassical economics, because neoclassical economics has very little to say about monopoly. Even though it is born at a time when capitalism has become monopoly. It talks about competition, it talks about free markets, but when you give freedom to a senile monopoly, capitalism, what you are not going to get the restoration of the growth dynamic, which is what we were told would happen if you gave capital more freedoms, as it was given in the last 45 years. What you get is the increasing demonstration or increasing manifestation of the vices of monopoly, rentierism, lack of investment, slow growth, financialization above all. So we have been witnessing all of this. And of course, the financialization, particularly in the US and the UK, was of course very systematically necessary also for the dollar system to function. So what we have today is that this whole system is reaching an impasse. The dollar system, it seems to me, is reaching a point where financializations are themselves, but the financialization strategy itself has been endangered by the rise of inflation. So the Federal Reserve is in a dilemma. Should it attack inflation by raising interest rates like Volcker did? If it did so, it's going to prick the financial bubble, the everything bubble that the US economy now has, which is, of course, going to have serious consequences for the dollar system. Or it will tolerate inflation, which is indeed what many people say it is doing. And if it does so, then the dollar will be eroded by that means. So what you have, and of course, for the last 20, 25 years, certainly in the new century, possibly going back to the Clinton years as well, well, really since the end of the Soviet Union, the United States has been also pursuing a policy of militarism as a replacement for the fact that its economic power is not sufficiently attractive to compel other countries to line up with it. So militarism is replacing economic power. Today, resistance is coming primarily from China and Russia. I would say that I used to talk about multipolarity a lot more, but I think we might actually be seeing a new kind of bipolarity, particularly because other countries like India or Brazil or South Africa, etc., they seem not to be capable of following an anti-neoliberal set of policies sufficiently strongly to continue their growth, but we will see what happens. So really, of course, so anyway, that's the situation we are at. It seems to me we are looking at a kind of a situation in which, as I said that in my title, that the fate of capitalism now hangs in the balance of international power. So I hope I've given you some account of the way I think about these things, and I really would look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Radhika. That was a lot of information, but if I take it at the core, it's the economic structure, the socio-economic structure that is ultimately responsible for uh, how we see then geoeconomics and geopolitics also develop. So focus on the economy first, then you understand how the developments, the political developments, have to follow, right?
Yeah, or alternatively, it's not politics and economics are not separate. You have to have a political economy and a geopolitical economy account. So within that, of course, you may focus on the organization of material life, which you may call the economy. But of course, there is no such thing as the economy separate from the rest of society. But yes.
Then
So that's why I use the expression political economy and geopolitical economy. And I don't like either geopolitics or geoeconomics, which is the term that Edward Luttwak invented back in the early 90s, I believe. But yeah.
Then let's open the floor, and maybe can I ask Jeffrey, the other economist on our panel, to maybe give your thoughts and questions?
Great. Well, thank you very much, Radhika. And it's very stimulating. And I like very much parts of it. And other parts I have both questions and somewhat disagreements with. I really like your your statement that realism is really a theory about U.S. aggression, because I think that this is actually uh, in its deep sense, realism is a theory about British and American behavior. It is not a universal theory, and it says countries are just inherently violent because they are inherently violent, both the British and the Americans. And so it's a kind of projection of how the U.S. behaves to say that inevitably there will be violence, therefore we will be violent. So I agree. I agree very much with this. Um, I'm not sure about some of the other definitions. I agree also with your critique very much. I think it's vital of the hegemonic stability theory, because this is a claim that only a hegemon can provide a global order. So we need a Pax Britannica or a Pax Americana or chaos. And I agree completely with that. It's very self-serving if you happen to be the hegemon to say that it's you or the deluge and that there's nothing else afterwards. And I think it is demonstrably false. Um, I'm not sure about definitions of liberalism, whether it is taken to mean that states disappear. And I'm a little bit, I actually am rather fundamentally more optimistic about the role of international markets in helping uh, what I would say is a broad phenomenon of catching up economic growth. Uh, so markets don't work when they are absolutely managed by a dominant power for the sake of extraction. They could be called markets, but it's a form of extraction. And that's what imperialism is, after all. You don't expect your colony to develop, you extract from your colony. And we need a clear theory of imperialism as an economic phenomenon, not only as a political phenomenon, to understand how the extraction works and what the imperial power does. And so if you observe during the period of imperialism that colonies did not grow, to my mind, that's not a contradiction to the idea that markets internationally can be a mechanism for growth. It's a reflection of the very purpose of imperialism, which is extraction. And extraction works in a number of ways. You don't build industry locally. You don't educate the population locally. You make sure that there are not mechanisms where your colony is going to become so self-aware and so powerful that it kicks out the imperial power. And so in that sense, markets are no guarantee. They're not even markets, really, but they look like markets. They're managed by companies. There's trade, but it's not really the only kind of market. And markets aren't inherently exploitative. It depends on their structure and management. I believe, for example, that China's growth after 1980 depended heavily on international markets, and that there was a benign period of about 30 years where the United States, either out of naivete or ideology or the interests of the corporate class, which was making a lot of money on investing in China, enabled
Yes.
China to have export-led growth. And without that, it would have been very hard to do within China itself. And I think, broadly speaking, again, and I'm generalizing over 1,000 caveats and footnotes and so forth, Japan's industrialization at the end of the 19th century, which was it turned into a militaristic, imperial, and even fascistic industrialization, was in some important sense supported by external markets from the Meiji Restoration onward. Japan's recovery after the 1950s, which was under a U.S. security umbrella, similarly with the so-called Asian tigers, which was, again, to an important extent in a very supportive U.S. security environment, was really export-led growth in an important way, and enabled specialization, upgrading technology, doing all the things that it's supposed to do. So I don't want to dismiss the idea of specialization, markets, trade, but I also absolutely agree that they come in many varieties and forms, and they can be completely exploitative. They can be a veneer of power. They can be a reality of growth. And for example, as China became as successful as it has become, the United States turned absolutely hostile to its free market ideology. So it started to recognize in 2010 something's going wrong. This is not what we want. We want a subservient China, not a successful China. Now we have to, quote, contain China. And so the supposed free market ideology turned out to be a thin veneer once it was realized that this was a threat to U.S. Delusional hegemony, I'll say. And one more point that I would disagree with, which is when you describe the world as multipolar in even 1910, I think you said, or around then. It was European imperial, I would say. Of course, we don't disagree on that, so I would just use the word differently. From my dating, the way I date things, the period from 1750 to 1950 was the European imperial age. I think it was incredibly nasty, incredibly vulgar, incredibly destructive, and that the middle period, 1910, was a competition of empires in Europe, but I would not call that multipolar. I would call it intra-European competition. But what I like about multipolarity today, and maybe this is just semantic, but just to clarify, that there really is a China, there's an India, there's a Russia that are absolutely thumbing their nose at the United States and saying, we're not part of your system. And that's, for me, multipolarity. The Western dominance was the age of Western imperialism, and in some sense, it ended at the end of World War II, with the United States becoming an empire of a different sort, of course, but with enough sovereignty in India and China and other places that they could achieve a development outside of the U.S. Outside of the U.S. security state. So not as vassals as the United States assumed they would be. The other thing I would say, just in terms of again, this is kind of classification and language. I would not say that all countries have, if I heard you right, but maybe I didn't, have had socialist industrialization, that have industrialized. The idea of a free market economy is a comic book, and always has been a comic book. Even in the height of free market ideology of Britain in 1850, of course, the East India Company was not a free market. It was a private army backed by a public army. And so there's never been, and I think Polanyi made the point, though there was claims and maybe even aspirations and ideologies of free markets. It's impossible. And no one would live in such a ghastly society, and nor could it actually be imposed. And it's also true that there's industrialization, period, always has been both private capital and public power together in many ways. So there's never a pure market system. But there's a difference, really a difference, of the Soviet Union in its heyday and Japan, for example. Japan was private capital in a one-state system, but it was private capital. And China has a lot of private capital. It's got a lot of state capital, too. The Soviet Union really was an excess. It was the idea that it would be state ownership and state planning, period. Whereas all successful countries, I'll say, are mixed systems of state and private, and that one is a cartoon to say it's all private. That's never been the case. And on the other hand, although in good Marxian view, which I believe in, the state may be the handmaiden of the private capital, but you still need the state to build the infrastructure, to provide the naval power and other things. So it's a mixed system. Whereas the attempt of the Soviet Union, which I happened to witness firsthand, of doing it all, because they really did in the end, by accident, go to an all-state system, was not a great success. It really was a mess by the end. And so I'm a believer in a mixed economy. I rather like Gershon Krohn's observation in 1952 that the later you come, the more you need the state to protect you from the outside predation of existing power and to catch up faster. And I think that was a really smart observation of Gershon Krohn, that you get more state later, partly because you understand, Britain really did stumble along in gradual development for a century and a half. Of course, the state was always there, but it was 2% growth. Whereas if you want to grow at 5 or 10%, you really need the state for sure to achieve 5 to 10% state growth. So I rather use the mixed economy idea, that we need that, and that all successful development is mixed economy. Then I'm a cosmopolitan, so I just want to take on that issue before I turn it back over to you, which is, I don't believe that nations go away, of course. This is, you'd have to be a fool. And I don't believe that nations or cultures or localities or ethnicities don't matter, of course. But I do believe in this idea of subsidiarity and governance at all scales. So I like the UN. I like regional bodies. I like national bodies. I like local bodies. I do not want the UN running my school system or paving my road. On the other hand, I don't want the nation state to decide on climate change. I would rather have a supranational framework in which we are trying to fix the atmosphere of the planet as a whole. So in that sense, I believe that what we should be always describing in a constructive and in a constructive approach or a normative approach is that we need governance at all levels. And I like the subsidiarity idea, which is leave it closest to the local level that is feasible with the success. But when it comes to nuclear arms, the oceans, space, climate, I want a UN. And so I want to make sure that we have that. I'm not sure I understand. I mean, there's a phrase that's used every day that I don't mean it just in an argumentative sense. I literally don't know what people mean about that they hate the globalists or the globalist critique, because this is part of both left and right. In one sense, I'm a globalist because I work for the UN every day without pay, but I work for the UN every day because I believe it's absolutely vital. But I'm also a localist too, because most of life is not going to be determined by at a global level, nor should it be. And the attack on globalism seems to mean many, many things. We don't want the UN to tell us what to do. Don't want the UN black helicopters. We don't want the UN imposing LGBTQ on us, which is the right-wing critique. I don't know exactly, but I don't like the term because I don't know if they mean. I think they mean no global governance, which I think is impossible in our interconnected world and would be completely destructive if we went the madman course of Donald Trump. So I think my bottom line is, I think I agree with you on almost everything except maybe definitions, but maybe not. I'm not sure if there are differences that are at the core of this or whether it's categories and language. So let me end there.
Then Radhika, please.
Sure. I mean, gosh, you've said so many really interesting things, and I actually think that we may end up at the end of this agreeing that most, if not all, our differences are about terms. So let me just focus. I mean, I'm really glad you like some of what I said, which is
A lot.
Yes. Great. And so let me just say that I mean, at one level, let me say I agree with you in very substantially about what you are saying about markets. But it seems to me what you are saying about markets is, and you said that the idea of a free market economy, you agree with Polanyi. It's a comic book thing. You agree with Polanyi. Markets always embedded. Great. We are completely agreed on that. So what you're saying is that markets will work provided they are properly managed by states for competition, for also in serviced by markets in terms of the provision of education, etc. Even industrial policy, you're not averse to that, etc. And of course, List himself was quite clear that the purpose of industrial policy, the purpose of state-directed development would be to enable a given country to go over that initial hump of industrialization, but eventually to join the world market, etc. So I think that, and I'm not necessarily opposed to that. I think free trade is only problematic if one country is producing computers and another country is producing bananas. But if one country is producing computers and another is producing TVs or whatever at an equal technological level, then there's trade within most of the EU, not all though, because there's also the Germany-Greece type problem. But anyway, you get my point. I mean, so we're fine with that. So I think, the gist of what you're saying, okay, then you said Japan's industrialization was supported by markets. Of course. But also, interestingly, Japan undertook a form of export-led industrialization, which had actually two consequences, interestingly. One is, of course, that it relied on an external market, which then means that you are essentially deindustrializing another part of the world. And also, when you engage in export-led industrialization, you actually don't give a fig about the material living standards of your own working class, because they are not your consumers. And I think that that's my main complaint about export-led industrialization. I think that you have to have a form of industrialization in which, as Henry Ford said, your workers should be able to buy. And it is interesting that Henry Ford as a phenomenon emerges in this period when the United States, in this early 20th century, when the United States is already coming up against the difficulty of lack of markets. So it is not surprising that, not that I agree with Ford on everything, but he was a thinking guy in his own way, and he figured this out. So that good for him. Anyway, so that's one thing. The second thing I would say is that yes, Marx. You see, there is a very interesting interesting relation between markets and planning. Because what is a firm? A firm is planned production. So you have so firms exist as little structures of planned production within markets. But of course, once you get monopoly, more and more of your economy is planned production under the authority of private capitalists. And at that, which is part of what Marx meant, that when you come to monopoly, the country will become ripe for socialism. Because if you have planned production, then why leave it under private control? Why not put it under public control? Why not put it under democratic control? Why shouldn't workers take it over? Because it is ridiculous that it should take place under. And of course, when takes place under the authority of private capital, it can be not only oppressive to workers, but it is also prone to rentierism, etc., etc. So for all of those reasons, there is absolutely no reason. And of course, today with information and communication technology, what you have is that these companies can plan extremely intricately. We all know about how, Walmart can plan exactly how many bottles of which shampoo need to be on which shelf of which store at what time. They have all these feedback loops of information. Well, you know what? That makes planning more possible in a democratic context. So that we should be able, and there's lots been written about this, which I only know that it has been written, and I know some of it. I haven't done a great study of it, but I think that this fundamental point is correct, that ICT actually enables us to plan better than ever, which is not to say that it is in fact one of the ironies that the Soviet Union disintegrated just when this kind of technology was coming online. I mean, just imagine that the astonishing industrialization was undertaken without availability of such such information technology. By the 1930s, the Soviet Union had become the second industrial power in the world. They continued to plan the economy, okay, not perhaps very well, I mean, we've all read our Alec Nov and we know what went wrong and so on, but fine. But they did manage to do a pretty darn good job, considering everything. And they gave Soviet citizens a standard of living which was at least roughly comparable to Western levels. And I think that is quite an astonishing achievement. And by the way, one thing I didn't manage to say here is that the form of industrialization that would take place after the early 20th century would have to be fundamentally different, because unless it was taking place under the umbrella of imperialism as it did in South Korea or Taiwan, it would be different in three ways. It would have to, number one, take place from a position to which the country has been set back by imperialism, which is not the case for the European countries. It would have to take place without the privilege of imperialism, because, and this is a long discussion, but essentially the agricultures of these countries would have to pay the price of industrialization. And and there should be a way of managing to do it in a way that anyway, it has led to problems in both China and Russia, as we know. But this is without the privilege of imperialism. And number three, in the teeth of imperialist resistance. So and also one may add one other thing, which is that they would not have the safety valve of exporting excess populations to the rest of the world, which the Europeans did. So okay. So in all of these ways, the industrialization and development of the rest of the world would have to be different. Okay, on your point about multipolarity, I mean, Okay, you are saying that up to 1750 to 1950 is the European imperial age, but it is in this period that the US industrialized, Japan industrialized, two non-European powers. So that, and I call it multipolar simply because these guys were competing with one another. But being capitalist powers as they were, their competition had certain consequences. Today's multipolarity will not have the same consequences because the powers that are now emerging are not other capitalist imperialist powers. But that's something else that we can discuss. And this is another reason why you need something like geopolitical economy, because you take seriously the idea that the dynamics of capitalism are the main determinant of foreign policy as far as the imperialist countries are concerned, as far as the successful capitalist countries are concerned. And all the trouble in the world has emanated from one corner, as Glenn calls it, what is it, the peninsula of Asia or whatever it is, it has emerged from this one corner. I agree with you what you said about the East India Company, etc. Polanyi markets are embedded, etc. Although, very interestingly, Polanyi's ideas are always read as if, there is a yo-yo between embedding and disembedding. We will have, free markets and then there'll be a reaction, etc. This double movement. But actually what Polanyi was saying in the Great Transformation, if you think about it, read the first sentence of the Great Transformation. What does he say? 19th century civilization has collapsed. And what he meant by that is that the conditions under which this yo-yo of yo-yo of embedding and disembedding, the double movement, that double movement will not occur. Now, what we need, Polanyi was saying, is we need some kind of socialism. That's what he was saying in 44. Okay. I agree with you. Now, on state and market, I will simply say that really it seems to me the issue is, particularly given that markets left to themselves, if they are left to themselves, but even when they are not left to themselves, within a capitalist context, they will lead to monopoly. Then monopoly corporations will dominate the state. Really, the issue is, does the state control the corporations or do the corporations control the state? And to me, once you have the state controlling corporations, you can all sorts of possibilities open up. You can have more or less planning based on the context, the need. You can be quite pragmatic about the boundary between plan and market, etc. And I think I think you probably agree with that. Cosmopolitanism, yeah, okay. And what's wrong with globalism? I actually was allergic to the term globalization, global this, global that, even at the beginning. Like, I said, what's this about? I mean, the states, because you see, the globalists did claim that states have become irrelevant. It was a reassertion of a certain type of cosmopolitanism. So I say, what are they talking about? And I also feel, and I used to say globalism is wrong, but now I say that globalism, whatever, it addles your mind. It prevents you from asking the right question. Let me give you a small example. The 2008 financial crisis, everybody calls it the global financial crisis, but there was nothing global about it. It was a North Atlantic financial crisis. It was a financial crisis in which idiotic Europeans, I'm sorry, but invested in the toxic securities. I mean, apart from Americans and the British, the Europeans invested in the toxic securities generated by the American financial system, and they suffered as a result. But everybody else, apart from suffering a sharp but short trade shock, sort of eventually, got up, dusted themselves off, and continued growing for quite a few years late. So in that sense, it was not a global financial crisis. And these terms encourage you to think you know something, when in fact you ought to be investigating its actual patterns. Where is FDI going? FDI is not going all over the world. Where are portfolio investments going, etc. You need to investigate the actual flows. What is the shape and form of them? When you use a term like globalization, it prevents you from asking all the right questions. Why do the global, why, and this is well before the hatred of globalism came along. That actually is simply, honestly, a result. I mean, to me, it's like my simple line on that is that Trump, what's interesting about Trump? Why did Trump win 2 elections? Because he figured out that you can no longer win elections by telling Americans that their economy is doing fine. He figured that out. But then, of course, because he wished to serve the same corporate capitalist class, except even a wilder wing of the corporate capitalist class than the normal ones. He then had to accompany this truth with a second lie. And the second lie was that your misery is because of trade, because of China, and because of immigrants. And so he encouraged this anti-globalism. But the thing is, it was never global in the first place. As lots of very interesting people pointed out, even back in the 90s and the 2000s, what passes for globalism is an increase in regionalization. And that is not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, why should you import something from 5,000 miles away when you can import it from 500 miles away? So, that's one thing. Yeah, other than that, I'll just say one thing, which is that, I find that you mentioned India in terms of its growth and so on. I really feel that I take very seriously the fact that, India right now has to be treated with a great caution. Its growth statistics, and economists who know better than me and are better statisticians than me have shown this, that its growth statistics are cooked. And if you actually looked at not cooked sounds bad, but they're based on certain faulty methodologies which have been adopted in about 10, 12 years ago. And these methodologies are exaggerating India's growth rate. And the primary problem, it seems to me, is that because they have, like all fascists, I'm sorry, but like all fascists, they destroy statistical capacity. So what they're doing is, instead of measuring actual economic activity, they are taking corporate activity as a proxy for the whole economy. But precisely this is a problem in a situation in which for the last 10 or 11 years, Modi government has prioritized the welfare of corporations above everybody else, so that the rest of the corporate economy is flourishing. Everybody else is suffering. And this is not a good economy. It is, in fact, a horrific economy. If you're one of the 3 to 5% of Indians who are doing okay, life's never been better. Everybody else is suffering. So, and there are no, at least in Brazil, you have like the PT. In India, we yet do not have such a force, which is a big problem. But okay, I'll end there.
Then I would ask maybe Jeff to quickly respond, and then anyone else who wants to add something or ask something.
Great. I'll be very brief. We have a lot to continue the discussion, but I have to go, and I think Radhika has to go also. So I'll be very brief. First, there was a finance minister in Chile under Pinochet who said, "I don't care whether we produce potato chips or computer chips. The market will determine that." Well, that's the wrong idea. We agree on that completely. Producing potato chips is not your way to success. Producing computer chips is a much better way to success, and that requires the state to play a role in this. That's number one. I think in the next round of discussion, I would add a lot more about the dynamics of innovation. China, for example, is an enormously competitive economy. They have had up to 400 electric vehicle producers. It's now being shaken down to perhaps a couple of dozen, but it's that competition, really a market competition, that has enabled China to come to the forefront of the world in electric vehicle production. Similarly, in solar power and many other things. I do think that innovation is linked to market competition in an interesting way, and that state enterprises, which are a Walmart or a whatever, but run by the state, as a service provider and as a planner, probably misses something about the dynamism of innovation, which I take to be absolutely key in first the nature of advanced, a high-income economy like China or the United States, and a feature of the economic structure that the Soviet system, for example, did not generate, other than in the military sector, which was very specific, but it was not a broadly innovative society, but it was very successful in one narrow range, which it devoted an enormous amount of resources to the military-industrial complex. And I would link that to the question of living standards and so forth. Just to say 2 points that I want to agree on in closing. It's very important to understand that late industrialization came in the context of either a permissive or a negative force from the prevailing powers. So the growth of industry in East Asia in the 1960s was in a very permissive U.S. security environment for a number of smaller countries and for Japan. And when the United States opposed industrialization, it was able to absolutely harm a would-be late industrializer. And that goes back 200 years of the point that that imperialist powers or dominant powers can frustrate countries that want their place in the sun. And this is very important, and it remains true until today. So I think that this is a very key point of analysis, which is completely overlooked by economists, by the way, in almost as a occupational, deep occupational trained failure. Everything about economic performance to neoclassical economics is about how you behave, not how anyone opposes you or supports you. And so failure means you're bad, whereas it could be you're killed from the outside. So I think this is extremely important. And then the final point on does the state control the corporations or the corporations control the state? In the United States, the corporations control the state. This is quite clear. It's really very Marxian, and it's very true. In the so-called Marxist state of China, well, it's whatever, maybe the socialist or the communist state, the state controls the corporations. If it leans too hard, it will do damage. So it is preventing the takeover of the state by some large tech companies, something like that. But it's been pretty deft at not crushing the private companies either. And I think that that's the skill. The skill is not to have a state governed by private companies, but also not to kill the private companies and their capacity to innovate. And I think China has done the best of this of all the major economies in the last 40 years.
Then thank you.
I just want to add one thing very quickly because I know you have to go. But I've recently written a piece exactly on the issue of innovation, and I'd love to share it. It's not
Wonderful.
published yet, but I'm happy to share because it's basically the title says it all really. How DeepSeek exposed Silicon Valley's sci-fin-fi model of innovation. Sci-fi, but add finance to it. We've
Yeah.
seen this movie before. It happened in the late 90s, and we're seeing it again. So this, I would like to poke a few holes. I mean, I don't disagree, about how China has innovated, but the Soviet Union also had many innovations to its credit. It was also capable of innovating. So there are different models of innovation, basically.